Mark, it's good to see you again.
Yeah, it's good to be back.
Yeah. I know that one of the things that really interests you is the whole way that we interpret the Bible, the way we look at the Bible, what glasses we've got on when we read the Bible,
exactly.
and how we interpret it.
Yes.
I know this is something you want to talk a little bit more about.
Yes, I've done some blogging on this, so if you want to recap, just go to those blogs. But I have become very concerned about the effect of culture on our interpretation of the Bible. And it gets you thinking about the Old Testament. You know, I work with the young people in Antioch, and one of the things I do with them is that they can ask me any question, you know. So one of the questions they always ask is, why is God so horrible in the Old Testament? It's quite like, oh, right, yeah, I suppose it does seem that way. And my daughter, my youngest daughter, once said to me, did Jesus come to save us from the God of the Old Testament?
That's a good question.
That's a shocker, isn't it?
They have a habit of doing that, the young people.
They do. You give them permission to ask the questions and off we go, And I've been brought up in church. There's certain things about the Old Testament I've just accepted because I was brought up to. But the days of persuading young people just to take the denominational line on certain issues, just to take the party line or accept answers as they are, they're over because they can Google these questions and they'll notice that Christians believe different things on them. And there's such a breadth of understanding of these things that it's not good enough to just teach young people to have a party line on things. Now we have to teach them how to understand things for themselves and how to pursue questions that they have and to reach answers that they're satisfied with. We have to teach them to do that.
Okay, so just imagine now I am a young person.
Yep.
And I'm thinking now I know we're not going to cover this in one 5-minute video blog. Okay?
Yeah.
But I know one of the key things is like, as you say, God, when we look at the Old Testament scripture, he seems to be this really sort of grumpy guy who, at the sleight of a hand, tells people to wipe nations out.
Yeah.
Women, children, the whole thing.
Yeah, and the animals, any animal lovers out there.
Yeah. Okay.
Might put you off God.
And then we've got this image of Jesus, gentle Jesus, meek and mild in the New Testament.
That's right.
How do we work at the two things? How do we equate the two things?
Well, I don't know about you, Tim, but I've grown up with the thing that we have to balance the Old Testament with the New Testament. Not a lot of detail of how you do that, but a classic thing in evangelical circles would be that you'd have a reading from the Old Testament and a reading from the New in part of the church service. When people preach, they would be careful not to overemphasize Old Testament. They'd bring New Testament in and so on. And I think that is a valid way of balancing, obviously. But in reality, it doesn't answer the difficult questions. And I remember recently just coming across those verses where Jesus said, if you don't want to know what the Father is like, get to know me. You get to know me, you get to know the Father. And and we know what it was Jesus because it's in red, And so that kind of brought home to me the resonance of what Jesus is saying there. He's saying, if you want to know what God is like, he's like me. If you want to know what God's manifesto is, we all talk about Jesus' manifesto for mankind being a Sermon on the Mount. It's actually God's manifesto as well. And it kind of raises all sorts of questions about the Old Testament. But I've developed this thinking now where any conclusion that I come to about God, which is contrary to the nature of Jesus, there has to be something wrong with how I've come to that conclusion. And it does throw up huge questions, but I'm settled and I feel safe in the knowledge that Jesus is telling the truth. Throws up loads of questions about the Old Testament, but we've had 1,500 years of warlike nations, of empire. Great Britain's an empire nation still fighting wars. The US and so on. Our theology is affected by that. we actually believe killing people, that somehow God would be behind that. But yet when you look at the nature of Jesus, nothing could be further from the truth. And so it does throw loads of questions up about the Old Testament. But what do you want to be secure in? Secure that you've somehow come to terms with war is okay and killing people's okay, but we kind of ignore what Jesus said about God? Or do we find security in that actually God the Father is like Jesus? His very nature is in Jesus. The fullness of God is in Jesus. If you find this kind of safety in that, all those questions about the Old Testament, they probably take us another 1,500 years to reprocess. But any conclusion, I'll finish with this, Tim, any conclusion that we come to about God, say that he was a bit mean there, or or that somehow it's okay to wipe people out and all of that kind of thing, because God did it. Those kind of conclusions that we can come to, we have to question how we came to those conclusions, because it is contrary to the nature of Jesus. It's quite challenging.